what you do is you figure out what the slope of the Phillips curve is, what this beta parameter in the Phillips curve is that relates the change in inflation to the change in unemployment, and you also figure out what the level of expected inflation is, which I've written here with a pi star simply because I prepared this slide too late on Tuesday night. It should be an e pi. I'll change that. And this u star for the natural rate of unemployment. The Phillips curve is going to go through the point at which inflation is equal to expected inflation and unemployment is equal to its natural rate. You might as well think of those as the definitions of expected inflation and the natural rate. Yeah? I'll give it to you. There's no easy way to derive it. And attempts by economists to figure out what beta should be are extremely hazardous and by and large unsuccessful. A study by Robert Lucas in the 1980s relating beta to the volatility of inflation was just named one of the 20 best economics papers written in the 20th century by a panel of the American Economic Association. And the rule of thumb he derived was that the more volatile inflation is, the steeper the Phillips curve will be. So that a situation in which inflation hasn't been very volatile for a long time, we'll see a pretty flat Phillips curve. While if, say, the country is next to undergoing a hyperinflation, the Phillips curve is going to be very, very steep indeed. But we have no good derivation from microeconomic foundations or from behavioral foundations of what it is. Instead, what we have is we essentially have this scatter. And our belief that this scatter is good enough and reliable enough that we'll make forecasts from it for the future, even though there's no good reason to think that we have a good, sound, quantitative definition of why this scatter simply happens to be. Okay, so the Phillips curve. It has a slope that I'm going to have to give to you on problems. It goes through the point where expected inflation, where kind of inflation is equal to expected inflation, and the unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Then if production is below potential, and if the unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate of unemployment, then inflation will be lower than its expected value. High rates of unemployment relative to the natural rate produce low levels of inflation relative to the expected rate. If expected inflation rises, if all of a sudden something happens that makes people think that inflation will be higher than they thought before, like, for example, ex-president, the late François Mitterrand of France, who ran for the presidency of France at the start of the 1980s on a socialist ticket, saying it's time to get France back to work again, to reduce unemployment, and if there's a little extra inflation, I don't really care. Well, Mitterrand's campaign convinced everyone that inflation was going to rise, so expected inflation went up. And so even without any change in unemployment, even without any reduction in unemployment below its natural rate, France saw a burst of inflation starting even before Mitterrand's inauguration and continuing through his first couple of years in office. If expected inflation rises, that's going to move the whole short-term Phillips curve up in this particular way. If expected inflation falls, similarly, that's going to move this whole short-term Phillips curve down. And I think there was one more. If production is above potential output, if the unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate, then you can bet that inflation is going to be above its expected value. That's the simple graphical analytics of the Phillips curve. So let's go back. Let's go back to your iClickers. Let's write down the Phillips curve equation, the bottom one here, and actually ask, if the natural rate of unemployment is 5%, if expected inflation is 4% per year, if our parameter beta is 1/2, and the actual unemployment rate is 8%, then what's the inflation rate going to be in this economy? What is the fact that the unemployment rate is so high above the natural rate of unemployment going to do to an economy where expected inflation is 4% per year? Okay. All right, and now let's figure this out. Right? The actual unemployment rate is 8%. That means that the actual unemployment rate is 3 percentage points higher than the natural rate of unemployment. With an actual inflation or unemployment rate 3% higher, we have a -3 for these terms here. Multiply it by our beta coefficient of 0.5, and we get a 1.5. So we're going to be subtracting 1.5 from the expected rate of inflation. The expected rate of inflation is 4% per year, so that should give us an answer D of 2.5%. What went wrong? Well, what went wrong with the majority answer is that when the actual unemployment rate is high, inflation is going to be lower than its expected value. That the Phillips curve slopes down and not up. That high unemployment goes with low inflation. Low unemployment goes with high inflation, not the reverse. The people doing C got that wrong. Let's try it again. The natural rate of unemployment is 5% and 2% expected inflation, a parameter of 1 for the Phillips curve rather than for 1/2. What's the inflation rate going to be for these parameters in this particular economy, which looks somewhat like us, except the actual unemployment rate is lower than our current one. Certainly expected inflation in the U.S. economy right now is about 2%. It's not that far different from there. And so once again, let's do it. Actual unemployment is 2 percentage points higher than the natural rate, so that's a -2. Slope of Phillips curve of 1, so you still have a -2. Expected inflation is 2% per year. 2% minus 2 is 0. We should get an answer of B, that the actual inflation rate is going to be 0%. That's what happened to Japan in the 1990s. Right? The actual inflation rate hit 0 and then went a little bit further and stuck. It didn't fall much below 0 because this Phillips curve relationship tends to break down in times of deflation, in times when consumer prices are actually falling. And with luck, we'll cover a little bit of that either before or after our kind of second midterm. But say for the United States, during the whole period since World War II, except for this one quarter in 2009, the inflation rate's been positive, and I don't think we really have to worry about deflation. Okay. Now, what determines the location of the Phillips curve? I already talked a little bit about this beta parameter that we pull out of thin air based on historical price patterns. Yeah, there we are. I talked a little bit about expected inflation and said it's usually fairly closely linked to what happened last year. But there are times when inflation expectations are what the Federal Reserve calls well anchored. That is, when just because inflation is high or low this year doesn't mean people are going to change their expectations of inflation because they have confidence the Federal Reserve is going to have an inflation target and hit it. But the expected rate of inflation, that's largely a matter of expectations. That's something that can shift quickly as people change their minds. The natural rate of unemployment, usually it's going to be stable. Say 5%, 6% in the U.S. today. Sometimes it won't be. There were all these arguments in the 1970s when baby boomers like me were entering the labor force. All these economists saying that people in their 20s, they're really lousy at job search. They don't know how to work the system to find good jobs. They tend to mouth off in front of their bosses and get fired. They also tend to be slackers. And so As a result, a labor force that has a lot of 20-somethings will have people who won't keep their jobs very long on average and will have a hard time finding their jobs after they lose them. So that we should expect the natural rate of unemployment in an economy to be higher when a baby boom generation is in its 20s than when a baby boom generation is like now in its 50s. And that seemed to be proved to be true, that the natural rate of unemployment fluctuates with demography. The natural rate of unemployment is supposed to fall when the labor force becomes more educated. It's going to move itself slowly over time. And there are also the worries about structural unemployment. If the structure of the economy is changing rapidly, so that a bunch of industries are shrinking rapidly and a bunch more are growing rapidly, won't it be the case that those workers who are losing their jobs in the declining industries will have a hard time picking up the skills needed in the expanding industries, and won't that push up the natural rate of unemployment? Answer, probably yes. And if your unemployment rate is high for a long time, as it has been in the United States now, as it's going to be in the United States, isn't it likely that a bunch of people who would normally be counted as unemployed won't really be looking for work, or will have lost so many of their job-related skills, or have lost so much of the ability to actually show up at 9 o'clock 5 days a week that people will be loath to hire them? Doesn't a prolonged period of high unemployment itself raise the natural rate of unemployment? I was reading, good God, I have 2 gigabytes of storage space in my Dropbox. That is genuinely scary. What do I have that's more than 2 gigabytes? I don't know. Well, actually, I think I do know. It's mostly audios of the lecture from this course that I've been moving around. That will take up a bunch of space. I was reading this morning an article by my old teacher, Peter Diamond from MIT, his Nobel Memorial Lecture from last year. A whole bunch of it was about structural unemployment and the extent to which we can expect high unemployment now to show itself in a higher natural rate of unemployment in the U.S. economy in the future. And on topics like this, Peter Diamond is the world's expert. In large part because of that, Larry Summers and Christy Romer persuaded Barack Obama to nominate Peter Diamond to the Federal Reserve Board, but now Senator Shelby from Alabama says he's unqualified, which strikes me as the most pinheaded thing said by a member of Congress in the past 2 weeks, even more pinheaded than David Andelfato's attack on Ron Paul. Peter Diamond's eminently qualified. We have this particular Phillips curve. Here I should put up this graph showing that if you think that actual inflation, or if you think that expected inflation is just what inflation was last year, you can say that the vertical axis on this graph shows the difference between actual inflation and expected inflation, and you do indeed get this downward sloping scatter showing that whenever unemployment is high, actual inflation is going to be lower than expected inflation. Evidence for the existence of a Phillips curve. If you look at the actual history of unemployment and inflation in the United States since 1950 or so, you get an interesting scatter, which at first glance looks like a complete and total mess. But if you use the idea of the Phillips curve, and if you think about what expectations of inflation were in the U.S. economy, you can kind of make sense of the actual scatter of unemployment and inflation in the United States over the past 60 years. Let's start in 1949, the last year when there actually was deflation, when consumer prices actually fell because of the late 1940s recession. The unemployment rate was high, and so you'd expect price increases, actual inflation to be less than expected inflation, and indeed prices did fall. Then the Korean War starts. And by 1951, the unemployment rate's down to less than 3.5% because of expansionary fiscal policy, and our inflation rate's up to 8%. The unemployment rate continues to fall a little bit in the mid-50s, and the inflation rate comes down after this big boom of wartime-related inflation is over. And then in 1954, you have a recession, and you go back to a more normal level. And then from 1955 to 1960, you see the economy performs a loop. As the unemployment rate falls, the inflation rate tends to rise. As the unemployment rate rises, the inflation rate tends to fall. And by the start of the 1960s, you're more or less back to normal. You can look at these loops that the economy did throughout the 1950s and say, yes, there's a relationship between unemployment and inflation. There's a Phillips curve. It's not a terribly tight or a terribly good thing. Lots of other things are going on in the 1950s. But in general, those times when unemployment was high, when those times where inflation was low, those times when unemployment was low were times when inflation was high. Moving forward to the 1960s, it fits a lot better. Say, starting right smack here in 60, 61, 62, 63. Things then go along quite fine until you hit 65, 66, 67, 68, 69. Then in 1970, things grow haywire. You could well argue that there was a quite stable Phillips curve in the 1960s, looking a lot like this red line here, that the economy moved along. And then something happened in 1970. That something that happened in 1970 was finally the breaking of inflationary expectations. That remember that the position of the Phillips curve is going to change if either the natural rate of unemployment changes or if expected inflation changes. The natural rate of unemployment wasn't changing much over this time period, and neither was the economy's expectations of inflation until 1970. And then starting in 1970, people begin to expect that not only that there'll be more inflation than there was on average in the 60s, but that inflation is going to keep and start rising. And so starting in 1970, the Phillips curve starts moving all over the place very quickly. And let me stop there, wish you all a good vacation, and say that I'll see you in a week and a half.